They hid the bomb under the seat of my snowmobile, waiting for a single spark. Kaiser caught the scent of death seconds before I did. He didn't run away. Instead, he attacked me, tackling me into the freezing snow to keep me from that machine. He saved my life that morning, but we could not save my wife. As I watched the flames turn the white snow black, I realized the explosion didn't just take her. It killed the good man inside me and woke up something far darker. The incessant drizzle of the Pacific Northwest draped over the Thorne estate like a heavy gray shroud. It was the 100th anniversary of the estate, a milestone that should have been celebrated with joy, but the atmosphere was thick with an unspoken tension. Elias Thorne stood on the edge of the sprawling stone terrace, his back turned to the warm glow of the ballroom windows. At 32, Elias was a man of quiet intensity, a lawyer who preferred the silence of the woods to the noise of the courtroom. He held a crystal tumbler of scotch that he had no intention of drinking. Beside him sat Kaiser, the only creature Elias fully trusted. Kaiser was a magnificent 5-year-old German shepherd with a rare silver-sable coat that seemed to blend perfectly with the misty twilight. The dog sat with the stoic posture of a seasoned guardian, his amber eyes scanning the perimeter of the dark forest line. Kaiser was not a pet who begged for attention. He was a silent partner, possessing a calm temperament that masked a fierce, protective intelligence. Inside the grand hall, Elias's father, Silas Thorne, held court. Silas was the patriarch of the region, a man who viewed the land not as an asset, but as a legacy. However, that legacy was under siege. A black sedan crunched over the wet gravel of the driveway, the sound sharp against the rhythm of the rain. A man stepped out, flanked by security. It was Vance, the director of Titan Corporation. He moved with the predatory grace of a shark entering unfamiliar waters. Elias watched from the shadows as Vance approached his father. The music inside seemed to fade as the two men faced each other. "Silas, your land is wasted potential," Vance said, his voice smooth but carrying a dangerous weight. "The Titan Corporation is offering you a future, a hydroelectric dam. It is clean energy, Silas, a legacy for your son." Elias tightened his grip on the glass. He knew the truth. The dam was a lie, a convenient cover to bury industrial toxic waste deep beneath the soil of their ancestors. Silas Thorne stood tall, his expression unyielding. "This forest is the lungs of our county, Mr. Vance, not its trash can," Silas replied, his voice echoing slightly in the sudden quiet of the room. "We do not sell our history, and we certainly do not poison the well from which we drink. Please, leave my home." The rejection was absolute. Vance's smile did not falter, but the warmth left his eyes entirely. He nodded slowly, a gesture that felt more like a threat than an acknowledgement. As Vance turned to leave, he spotted Elias standing in the doorway with Kaiser. The director paused, buttoning his suit jacket, and looked down at the large dog. "Beautiful animal," Vance murmured. He reached out a hand, intending to pat the dog's head in a show of false dominance. In that moment, the air grew heavy. Kaiser did not growl. He did not bark or bare his teeth. Instead, the great silver dog simply turned his head away, deliberately breaking eye contact and staring into the dark woods. It was a gesture of absolute dismissal. Kaiser refused to acknowledge the man's existence. Vance pulled his hand back as if he had touched a hot stove. He looked at Elias, his eyes cold. "Shame," Vance whispered, stepping into the rain. "Some things are too stubborn to survive the changing times." As the tail lights of the sedan faded into the mist, Elias rested a hand on Kaiser's neck. He could feel the dog's muscles tense beneath the thick fur. The war had begun, and the first shot had been fired in silence. 3 days after the confrontation at the estate, the phone rang in the dead of night. The police reported that Silas Thorne's vintage sedan had plunged off a winding cliffside road. They called it mechanical failure, specifically a sudden loss of brake pressure, but Elias knew better. He arrived at the county hospital under the cover of a torrential downpour. The building, usually a place of sterile bustle, felt abandoned. The fluorescent lights hummed with an unsettling flicker, casting long, wavering shadows against the linoleum floors. Elias walked briskly down the hallway of the intensive care unit, his wet coat dripping onto the tiles. Beside him, Kaiser moved like a ghost, his claws clicking softly. The German shepherd remained glued to Elias's leg, his ears swiveling like radar dishes, picking up frequencies too low for human hearing. When they reached room 304, Silas lay motionless, connected to a rhythmic ventilator. The rhythmic hissing of the machine was the only sound in the oppressive silence. Elias looked at the security station down the hall. It was empty. The night guard was missing. A cold knot of dread tightened in Elias's stomach. This was not negligence. It was an opportunity. Without wasting a second, Elias unlocked the wheels of his father's heavy hospital bed. He gritted his teeth, pushing the bed out of the room and guiding it swiftly down the corridor into a cramped storage room filled with linens and medical supplies. He locked the door from the inside, leaving only a sliver of the blinds open to watch the hallway. He crouched in the dark beside the bed, one hand on Kaiser's neck. "Wait," Elias whispered. Minutes later, the elevator at the far end of the hall chimed. The sound was deafening in the quiet. Two figures stepped out. They wore green surgical scrubs and masks, but they moved with a military precision that no doctor possessed. As they approached room 304, Kaiser's nose began to twitch violently. The dog did not smell the sharp sting of rubbing alcohol or the stale scent of sickness. Instead, his olfactory senses were flooded with the distinct metallic pungency of gun oil and the acrid sweat of adrenaline. Elias felt the fur on Kaiser's back stand straight up. The dog's body went rigid, ready to launch. Elias pressed a firm hand on the dog's shoulder and signaled for silence. He pointed toward a metal utility cart parked precariously just outside their hiding spot, visible through the cracked door. Kaiser understood. The silver-sable shepherd slipped out of the storage room, keeping low to the ground. He did not growl. He did not attack. Instead, he lunged forward with his full weight, slamming his shoulder into the stainless steel cart. The cart crashed to the floor with a thunderous, clattering roar that echoed through the entire floor like an explosion. Metal trays and glass vials shattered against the tiles. Immediately following the crash, Kaiser let out a deep, booming bark that sounded like a warning shot. Startled by the chaos, the two men in scrubs froze. From the stairwell below, heavy boots could be heard pounding up the stairs as the building security, alerted by the noise, rushed toward the commotion. Realizing their cover was blown, the assassins turned and sprinted back toward the emergency exit, vanishing before the guards burst through the doors. Elias slumped against the wall of the storage closet, exhaling a breath he did not realize he had been holding. Kaiser trotted back to him, sitting calmly beside the bed as if nothing had happened. The storm had turned Highway 101 into a river of asphalt and oil. Rain lashed against the windshield of the battered pickup truck, blurring the neon sign of the roadside diner into a smear of red and buzzing electricity. Inside the cab, Kaiser sat on the passenger seat, his silver-sable fur damp from the humidity. The German shepherd pressed his nose against the cold glass, his amber eyes fixed on the diner entrance, where his master had just disappeared. Elias Thorne walked into the diner, water dripping from the hem of his trench coat. The place was empty, save for the cook in the back and the two men waiting in a corner booth. Vance, the Titan director, looked out of place in his tailored Italian suit against the cracked vinyl seats. Sitting across from him was Sheriff Boyd. Boyd was a massive man, a wall of muscle and fat whose uniform strained at the seams. He had the ruddy complexion of a man who drank too much and the hard, flat eyes of a man who had forgotten the oath he swore to protect the public. He was the law in this county, and he had been bought and paid for by Titan. Elias slid into the booth, his hands trembling slightly beneath the table. He did not order food. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and impending violence. "I am not here to negotiate the price of the land," Vance said, cutting straight to the point. "I am here to discuss the price of your survival." Elias remained silent. He excused himself, walking stiffly toward the restrooms at the back of the diner. Inside the small, grimy room, he reached behind the porcelain tank of the toilet. His fingers brushed against cold steel. It was a rusted, snub-nosed revolver, taped there hours before. He peeled it loose, checking the cylinder. It was heavy, a weight that felt alien in the hands of a scholar. Outside, Kaiser let out a low whine. The dog could sense the spike in pheromones, the sharp scent of fear drifting from the building even through the rain. Inside the diner, Elias returned to the table. He did not sit. Boyd saw the change in Elias's posture. The sheriff sneered, his hand dropping to the service pistol holstered at his hip. "Sit down, Professor," Boyd growled, unsnapping the holster, "or I will put you down." Boyd drew his weapon first. From the truck cab, Kaiser saw only the visual echoes of the tragedy. A sudden, blinding flash of white light erupted inside the diner, illuminating the silhouettes of the three men for a split second. It was immediately followed by a dull, muffled thud that was swallowed by a crack of thunder overhead. Inside the diner, two shadows collapsed onto the table, then slid out of view. Moments later, the diner door burst open. Elias stumbled out into the rain. He was gasping for air, his face pale and slick with sweat. He reached the truck, fumbling with the door handle, his fingers slipping uselessly over the metal. He leaned over the hood, retching violently onto the wet pavement, his body convulsing with the shock of what he had just done. Finally, he managed to wrench the door open and collapsed into the driver's seat. He tried to insert the key into the ignition, but his hands shook so violently that the key rattled against the steering column, unable to find the slot. He was hyperventilating, on the verge of a total breakdown. Kaiser moved across the seat. The large dog pressed his warm body against Elias's trembling side. He lowered his head and firmly licked the back of Elias's freezing hand, then nuzzled his wet nose against Elias's cheek. The sensation of warmth and the steady, rhythmic breathing of the animal anchored Elias. He squeezed his eyes shut, taking a ragged breath. The shaking subsided just enough. He guided the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and the truck peeled away onto the highway, disappearing into the black throat of the night. The winter of 1974 found Elias living in the remote solitude of the Canadian Rockies. The landscape was a vast, blinding expanse of white, a stark contrast to the dark, rain-soaked forests he had left behind in Oregon. Here, he was no longer a lawyer or a fugitive. He was simply a man trying to forget. He was not alone. Beside him was Elena, the woman who had become his sanctuary. Elena was vibrant, with dark, laughing eyes and a warmth that defied the biting cold of the north. She knew Elias had secrets, heavy and dangerous ones, but she had chosen to love him without asking for the full weight of his past. She was the innocence he thought he had lost forever. Kaiser, however, had not forgotten. The German shepherd had adapted to the snow, his silver coat thickening against the frost, but his temperament remained coiled and alert. He spent his nights sleeping across the threshold of their cabin door, a silent sentry guarding against ghosts. One crisp morning, the sky was a piercing blue. Elias and Elena prepared to head into the nearest town for supplies. Their primary mode of transport was an old, rugged snowmobile parked under a tarp near the shed. As they stepped out into the biting air, Kaiser bolted ahead. Usually the dog loved the snow, leaping through the drifts with puppy-like abandon. But today, as he approached the snowmobile, his demeanor shifted instantly. Kaiser skidded to a halt a few feet from the machine. His nose worked furiously, inhaling the crisp air. Beneath the smell of gasoline and pine, there was something else, a foreign scent. It was the metallic tang of a stranger's sweat, mixed with the faint, chemical acridity of an accelerant. Elias crunched through the snow, keys in hand. "Ready to go?" he called out, his breath pluming in the cold. As Elias reached for the handlebars, Kaiser lunged. The dog snarled, a deep, guttural sound that vibrated in his chest. He snapped his jaws around the cuff of Elias's heavy winter trousers and yanked him backward with surprising force. Elias stumbled, nearly losing his balance. "Kaiser, stop!" he commanded, confused by the aggression. Kaiser did not let go. He stood between Elias and the machine, his hackles raised, barking sharply at the empty air around the vehicle. Elias frowned. He looked down at the pristine snow around the snowmobile treads. There, barely visible under a light dusting of fresh powder, was a boot print. It was too large to be his, and the tread pattern was unfamiliar. Realization hit him like a physical blow. Someone had been here. Before Elias could voice the warning, Elena stepped past him. She was smiling, swinging her helmet by the strap. "You and that dog are too serious today," she teased lightly. "I will drive." She moved quickly, stepping onto the running board of the snowmobile before Elias could turn his head. "Elena, no!" Elias screamed, his voice cracking with terror. She turned the key. The explosion shattered the silence of the mountains. A massive fireball erupted from the chassis of the snowmobile, tearing the machine apart in a violent concussion of heat and shrapnel. The shock wave knocked Elias backward into the deep snow. When Elias opened his eyes, the world was ringing. A pillar of thick black smoke rose into the blue sky, staining the purity of the winter morning. Burning debris lay scattered across the white ground like jagged scars. Elias scrambled to his feet, ignoring the ringing in his ears, and ran toward the crater where the machine had been. There was nothing left but twisted metal and flame. He fell to his knees, a scream building in his throat that no sound could express. Beside him, Kaiser lay in the snow, whimpering softly. The dog's leg was bleeding from a piece of flying debris, but he dragged himself over to Elias, resting his heavy head on his master's lap, offering the only comfort left in a world that had just turned to ash. The year was 1977, 3 years after the explosion that had silenced the mountains of Canada. Elias Thorne had passed away quietly in his sleep, leaving the Thorne estate without a patriarch. But the vacuum of power did not last long. Elias returned to Oregon, but the man who stepped out of the black limousine was unrecognizable from the nature-loving lawyer who had fled years prior. Gone were the tweed jackets and the hesitant, scholarly gaze. Elias now wore bespoke charcoal suits that fit his frame with razor-sharp precision. His hair was slicked back, and his eyes, once full of idealistic fire, were now 2 pools of dark, impenetrable ice. He moved with a calculated stillness, speaking only when necessary, his voice devoid of warmth. The war against Titan Corporation had entered a new phase. Elias did not seek blood. He sought total annihilation through the very instruments he once respected, the law and the media. From his high-rise office overlooking the city, Elias orchestrated a campaign of financial strangulation. He leaked devastating internal memos to the national press, exposing Titan's illegal dumping practices. He utilized obscure environmental statutes to freeze their assets and halt their construction projects indefinitely. At the center of this cold empire sat Kaiser. The German shepherd had aged significantly. His muzzle was now dusted with white, masking the silver-sable fur of his youth. The explosion in the mountains had left him with a permanent, stiff limp in his right hind leg. He no longer bounded through the halls or chased after falling leaves. Instead, he moved slowly, his claws clicking heavily against the hardwood floors, a rhythmic reminder of the price they had paid. Kaiser spent his days lying under Elias's heavy mahogany desk, his head resting on his paws. He was the only creature allowed in the room during high-level strategy meetings. When lawyers and fixers entered, sweating under Elias's scrutiny, they would often glance nervously at the large, silent dog watching them from the shadows. One late evening, after the staff had gone, Elias sat alone in the dim light of his office. The city rain streaked against the floor-to-ceiling windows. He held a file containing the bankruptcy filing of a Titan subsidiary, a victory that should have brought satisfaction. Instead, he felt nothing but a hollow echo in his chest. He pushed the chair back and reached down. Kaiser lifted his head, his amber eyes cloudy with age, but still sharp with recognition. Elias ran his hand over the thick scar tissue running down the dog's flank. Kaiser let out a low, rumbling sigh and leaned his weight against Elias's leg. "We are almost done, old friend," Elias whispered into the empty room. He stood up and walked to the window, watching the city lights flicker below. He had become a ghost in his own life, a man who commanded immense power but possessed nothing of value, save for the crippled dog at his feet. The transformation was complete. The idealist was dead, and the dawn had risen. The flashing bulbs of press cameras turned the steps of City Hall into a blinding stroboscope of white light. Elias Thorne sat at the center of the long oak table, a row of microphones in front of him. To his right sat the governor, beaming with political pride. To his left sat the bewildered board members of the Titan Corporation, who had just realized they had been completely outmaneuvered. Elias uncapped his fountain pen. With a steady hand, he signed the documents that officially transferred the ownership of the entire Thorne Forest to the federal government, designating it as a protected national preserve. In one stroke of ink, the land became untouchable. Titan could never dig, never drill, and never build. As the ink dried on the page, the hammer of justice fell elsewhere in the city, synchronized like a ticking clock. At the Titan headquarters, federal agents swarmed the lobby. Vance, the once arrogant director, was led out in handcuffs, shielding his face from the news crews, documenting his arrest for massive tax fraud and environmental negligence. Miles away, on a treacherous stretch of icy mountain road, a black SUV carrying the corrupt sheriff lost control on a hairpin turn. The vehicle skid silently over the edge, disappearing into the white abyss below. There were no witnesses, and the snow quickly covered the tire tracks. Elias returned to the estate that evening as a hero in the public eye, but the house remained a fortress of silence. He retired to his study, the fireplace casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. He was not alone for long. Arthur, the family's longtime attorney, knocked softly and entered. Arthur was a man of soft features and nervous smiles, the one who had handled the logistics of Elias's exile in Canada years ago. He held 2 glasses of scotch, his face flushed with the thrill of victory. "Elias," Arthur said, stepping forward, "we did it. Your father would be proud." Kaiser was lying on his rug near the hearth. The old dog had been lethargic all day, his breathing heavy. But as Arthur took a step toward the desk, something primal snapped within the animal. Despite the arthritis plaguing his joints, Kaiser rose. It was a slow, painful movement, but he did not stop until he stood directly between Elias and Arthur. The hair along the dog's spine stood rigid. For the first time in 3 years, a deep, vibrating growl rumbled from Kaiser's chest. It was not a sound of warning. It was a sound of judgment. Arthur froze, the smile faltering. What is wrong with him? He knows me? Elias looked at the dog. He saw the way Kaiser's ears were pinned back, the way his body shielded his master. He remembered the explosion in the snow. He remembered that Arthur was the only person who knew the exact location of the cabin in Canada. The realization was not a shock, it was a confirmation. Elias looked up at Arthur. His expression did not change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "Kaiser is never wrong," Elias said softly. He gave a subtle nod to the shadows in the corner of the room. 2 of his personal security guards stepped forward. They took the glasses from Arthur's trembling hands and escorted him out of the room. Arthur did not protest. The look in Elias's eyes told him that his fate had been sealed long ago. The heavy oak doors clicked shut. Elias stood up and walked around the desk. He sank to his knees on the rug, disregarding the pristine crease of his suit trousers. He wrapped his arms around the old dog's neck, burying his face in the coarse, silver fur. Kaiser let out a long breath and rested his chin on Elias's shoulder. Outside, the snow began to fall, blanketing the forest in eternal white. Elias had won the war, but as he held on to the only friend he had left, the silence of the empty house was deafening. We often think we rescue them, but in our darkest hours, it is they who rescue us. Kaiser taught us that loyalty is the only thing money cannot buy and power cannot corrupt, remaining the last glimmer of humanity in a cold world. If you believe in a bond that transcends words, honor it by sharing this story and joining our pack with a subscription. There are more secrets waiting to be uncovered, so follow us into the next mystery by clicking the video appearing on your screen right now.